Welcome to The Truth in Its Art, your source for conversations at the intersection of arts, culture, and community. I am your host, Rob Lee, and I am super excited to have you with us today. My next guest is a Chicago-based artist, educator, and cultural producer who collaborates with artists and art organizations in her role as museum manager at the 21C Museum Hotel Chicago. Please welcome Jennifer Murray. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and talk about all things art with you.
I am super excited, and as I'm one to do, right? Especially because we've met already. We met in person, which is a plus, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But as I like to say, since I've included some of the video component of this podcast, thank you for wearing your glasses. Whenever there's a person wearing glasses, I have to acknowledge it.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I'm at that point where life is just easier to see with glasses than not. So yeah, sometimes I wear the contacts and it's just not what it used to be. So I can acknowledge that.
I didn't even have the option. It was one of those things where you go there to the eye doctor and he's like, the shape of your eyes, sir. And I was like, this is a lot.
No, I wore contacts every day for decades. And now I'm at the point where, yeah, it's just, there's too much going on. Can't see.
It's that thing where it's like even my image, the image of me, it's a lot of me smiling as a person who I'm told I don't smile enough, but every image of me, it's me smiling. And one of the reasons why I'm a little self-conscious about smiling now is because my partner, she'll say like, your eyes disappear when you smile or when you take your glasses off. So yeah, it's that. I was like, this is what we're doing. This is
no.
Those small things that just show you care.
Yes.
So before we get into the deeper questions, I want to go back and give you the sort of space and opportunity to introduce yourself in your own words. I find like a lot of times, and we were touching on a little bit, we get those files, we get that Dropbox invite. And sometimes it's really grandiose, and somehow at times the essence of who the person is at their root is lost. So getting it directly from the person, there's a little bit more value and truth in that. So if you will, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Jennifer Murray. I'm an educator, artist, arts administrator, curator, parent, many things. Currently the museum manager at 21C Museum Hotel Chicago. And prior to this role, I was the executive director at Filter Photo here in Chicago for about 8 years. And I've also been a longtime educator. I taught undergraduate students photography for about 20 years. This is maybe the first academic year that I've not taught in a long time. So yeah, I wear a lot of different hats. I'm a trained art handler and installer, many years running a nonprofit and working as an arts and culture worker. So I kind of do lots of different things in the art spheres.
Thank you. See, I learned a few things in there that from my, if you watch these movies, right? And like, let's say it's a, like a thriller or something where the cops are involved and you'll see that board that has the string that connects everything.
Yes.
I was doing that. I do that when I'm looking at like, all right, what's the through line? Who's the guest? Yeah. And I just learned a bunch of things from what you just said. So thank you for that. So I want to, in this attempt to go backwards, where does the story begin? Like, what was there, a defining moment, a memorable experience, maybe a show, a piece of art, an image that really kind of ignited that path or caught your eye, and you're like, I want to do something in art. I'm not sure where, but where's the story begin for you?
This is a tough one for me. This is a tough question. I did see your questions in advance, and this was the one that I was like, it's a tough, where does it start? So I will say I have an MFA in photography from Columbia College, Chicago, and I have a bachelor's degree in sociology and fine arts. And as an undergraduate student, all of the questions about that combination of art and sociology was, oh, you must like to take pictures of people. It's like, no, not at all. That's not at all what I like to do. And so I think those connections took me a long time to be able to articulate. But I would say that for me, it sort of goes back further than that, and thinking about what does it mean to be a creative person. And I grew up kind of a sciencey, bookish kid and wanted to be a veterinarian. And then I went to college and hated my first biology class, but loved my photography class.
Oh,
And I think for me, it's because photography is also science. And so the kind of physical aspects of analog photography, loading the camera, being in the darkroom, rocking the tray, all the sort of, learning about the chemistry, all of those things excited that sort of sciencey part of me. And then I also was beginning to realize I'm just a person that likes to work with their hands. And when people say that, I feel like it's kind of a common thing that people say. It's like, well, what does that mean? And for me, that means that, like, since early childhood, I was rearranging the furniture in the living room while my mother was at work. And she would come home and just be like, okay, this is where the couch is now. And so that doesn't seem like an arty or, creative thing. But, for me, it is all a part of that same idea of, like, wanting to see the world differently,
yeah.
Wanting to have some control over what that looks like, and wanting to use my hands to do that. And so for me, it was really kind of a path through photography in college that helped me sort of bring all of those things together. I like to work with my hands, and I'm really interested in solving visual problems, both 3D and 2D, which I think is really what leads me to not only make things, but also want to handle art and want to be in a position where I'm handling and touching art objects, and in addition to making my own work, but sort of creating things conceptually with other people, but then also kind of physically wanting to kind of really be in there where all the stuff is actually happening with art objects. So I don't know
That's
if that's kind of a clear answer, but the meandering path.
Oh, no, no, no. No, thank you for that. I think, again, I've been on this belief of you let folks cook. You get everything out of it. And what happens for me, it makes me look like I'm much more talented than I'm actually am. I can knock off a couple more questions later when you let the person just cook.
Yes.
But thank you. And I'm always curious where one sort of like beginnings are, and like maybe how close or how they see the world through maybe that initial like interest in arts and creativity. I've talked about it before, and I shared it with you before we got on. I was able to be a part of a cartoon and comics sort of like community and an event. And that's where I thought I was going to go into. I thought I was going to be a comic book illustrator when I was a kid. That was what I wanted to do. That's all I was interested in. And sure, I've returned to it maybe in a different degree as an adult, but it was that sort of period where it just wasn't going to be for me. This version of it wasn't going to be for me. And I do this, and I have been doing this for a big chunk of my life for about it'll be 16 years in February. So playing with audio, working with audio, doing storytelling, and, facilitating storytelling is the way I really like to do it. You guys are doing all the talking. If I can cut more of me out of this, I will. It's like an editing note. So in it, and I want to talk about this one because we met through like my interest in the 21C hotel just macroly, and then it just so happened I happened to go to Chicago and stay there with my partner back in May, I believe, for a convention with the day job. It was something there, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna be in Chicago, and we met. We had coffee. Thank you again for the coffee. Um, so for folks that are undipped, and I really, really love the hotel, each place, each location I've stayed. It's a concept that really just aligns for what my values are and what I dig in visiting a place. And the exhibit that was there back in May, I really dug that as well. A lot to talk about. I was like, oh, I can't wait till we can get this interview booked. So for folks that are undipped and unfamiliar with the 21C Museum Hotel, what is it? What was the concept? Things of that nature. I'm just trying to get a little bit of of that? Because I'm curious, but I'm sure folks are like, what are you talking about 21C? Is that a band?
Sure.
Like, what are we
Yeah,
doing?
yeah. No, absolutely. I can dig in. So 21C Museum Hotel is this kind of really beautiful concept where there are 8 hotels. And I usually describe it as being kind of middle America, meaning it's not on the coasts. And it's really a permanent art collection that is kind of spread across those uh, various hotels. We have a chief curator, Alice Grace Stites, and Alice curates from the permanent collection. And the permanent collection is really begun by Laura Lee Brown and Steve Wilson, who are still actively collecting. And it really began in Louisville, Kentucky, as a way to both showcase their kind of really amazing 21st century art collection, but also kind of help revitalize downtown Louisville. And this was kind of early-ish 2000s. And so they had this idea for a museum downstairs with a hotel upstairs. And it did all of the things that they hoped it would do. It brought people to Louisville to not only stay in the hotel, but also to see their amazing art collection. And they really thought of it as kind of a one and done. But, other kind of investors came to the table and said, this is amazing and we want to do this in our city. So now we have Chicago is this kind of northernmost, and a couple of locations in Kentucky, Cincinnati, and North Carolina, Bentonville, Arkansas. And I'm missing a few others in there as well. But the concept is really a thematic exhibition that pulls from the permanent collection. The collection is, I would say it's really kind of a vigorous example of 21st century art. And so that's where 21C comes from, the term, is that all of the art that is collected is from 21st century artists. And some of that work is really challenging and really exciting. And I think that our curator, Alice Grace Stites, does this amazing job of kind of putting together topics that are really relevant to the time that we're in. And when an exhibition travels, so currently we have Offspring New Generations, which is, I believe, the show that you saw, and that show will travel to another 21C. It may go in, it may rest, it may go into storage, and then if it comes back out, at a different point in time, in a different location, a different 21C, it generally gets adapted and updated. And so it might get adapted for the new space that it's in. If it is going to be in St. Louis, then it may get adapted for that space. And then it may also get, adapted or updated for the time period. And so some pieces may cycle out and some newer acquisitions might cycle in, so that the concepts were always really fresh and really meant to be thought-provoking and, provocative. But also, the other really important thing about 21C is that because it's a hotel, it is free and open to the public 24/7, which is, of course, unlike, most museums across the country. So you can go in at any point. Anybody can come in. There's kind of no barriers to access, which is, I think, a really important part of 21C's mission, is that we are really providing this space for anyone and everyone to come in and not only see the exhibition, but every piece has didactic wall labels so that they can learn about not only the concept of the exhibition but also the individual works of art.
That's great. And that's the only, like, in the 2 times I think I said this where we met. This has only been 2 times that I've been in the state of Illinois. I won't even say I was in Chicago previous. I was in some county that was on the outskirts, and the hotel's the only museum experience I had when I was there.
I love that.
And I dug it. I was just like, man, take these pictures. What is it? How can we slide some out? No, I can't do that. But it was great, and it really like rounded out sort of what that better part of a week I was there, but what that period was like. And I stayed at the, I think it's no longer around, the location in believe Nashville, that I think that's now since closed, but that was just that initial entry point of falling in love with the concept. And it's like, I'm going to all of them. That's literally the thinking.
Yeah, we definitely get a lot of repeat customers, right? A lot of folks that are here because they do love to kind of make the rounds at 21C. It's a beautiful hotel, and so it's a great kind of hotel experience. But then, to your point, it's also a really great art viewing experience.
I think I'm going to create a passport, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Get your
at each
stamp.
location. Yeah. So I'm curious as it relates to your role, within the hotel, museum hotel, how, like I saw this interview recently with Rick Rubin, and he was talking about having sort of these art jobs or art related jobs, but not like for instance, if I was doing something in the arts related to, this audio thing that I'm doing, I don't want to like be sullied about like the rigors of like this is my main thing, this is the only thing, this is how I feed myself, and some of my creativity kind of slides away. So we do these jobs that are associated and they're fulfilling, but they're not exactly what we're doing creatively. There's sort of a barrier between the two. So talk a bit about like sort of your work, your day to day as a museum manager.
Mhm. Yep. I feel like this is potentially like this big can of worms that I love this topic. But the sort of easy place to start is that I'm the museum manager here. And so what does that mean? So every 21C has a museum manager. And I've already talked about kind of our chief curator and the work that she does to kind of create thematic exhibitions, and working kind of with the collection. What the sort of cohort of museum managers do is we very often are the only person on property that has art background, art knowledge. So my job is really very multifaceted. So my job is to sort of safeguard and manage the art that we have on property, and that means just making sure everything is clean and in good shape, and making sure nothing gets damaged and all of that stuff. And but then that's coupled with kind of curating arts related to bring people into our space. And that looks different in every city. And in Chicago, because we have such a robust arts community, a lot of that is kind of building partnerships with those other organizations. And then, we all have a space that we call the Elevate at 21C, which is where a museum manager kind of works with local artists within the community to curate an exhibition, generally on a kind of smaller scale and a smaller time frame. So temporary exhibitions, I change out my Elevate artist once a quarter. And I work with Chicago area artists so that we, are constantly kind of building those connections within the art community in Chicago, and also kind of showcasing work that is not necessarily a part of the kind of permanent installation that we have. And so that means that I do a lot of different things. Any given day is like I'm running around dusting frames. And we should also talk about the penguins. I have some penguin wrangling to do. We can go back to the penguins. And making sure that things are kind of working. And sometimes that's AV, and sometimes it's making sure that, the videos are running the way they're supposed to for video work. And sometimes that means downloading files from Dropbox that an artist has sent me, per our earlier conversation. And sometimes it means being here for evening events and having worked with an organization to help, plan that event. And that can be a panel discussion or, book signings or kind of work that we're doing to kind of bring in folks for events. So it kind of varies. And kind of to your point about how does that work sort of dovetail with kind of creative practice? I think it's interesting because, for me, it is one, it keeps you working within that sort of art ecosphere, right? Whether you're working as an artist or a maker, or whether you're working as a curator, or whether you're working as a cultural worker, an arts programmer, all of those jobs within that ecosphere, they all sort of inform one another, right? And it's all sort of one big happy family and community, and regardless of kind of what role you play within that. That said, I think that there is something to be said for not having your sole source of income be your creative work. And that's the can of worms, right? Because I think that, whether we're talking about music or whether we're talking about contemporary art, I think there is always this pressure to produce for the producer, for the maker. And I think when you are tethered to that for income, I think it does have an impact on your creativity, right? I think it does, there is sort of a, I think a lot of artists, there is like a wonderful sense of freedom in knowing that they can go to their studio and make art and they have a gallery that's going to sell that art for them. And I think for other artists, there is, sort of this mounting pressure of, well, maybe I want to do something creatively that's different, that is not in line with what I've been doing. And is that okay, right? Do I have the artistic freedom to be able to do that given the sort of financial entanglement that I have with, late stage capitalism, and that we all have. So yeah, I do think that it's complicated. And for me, I've always worked sort of within the art community, but kind of like maker adjacent, right? Like I haven't ever had or wanted to be in a situation where like objects that I make are in any way a source of income for me.
Sure.
And I think there's pluses and minuses, I think that, a lot of it has to do with identity and how do we identify? Do I identify as an artist? No, that's not the first word that comes out of my mouth. And, what does it mean to be an artist? Does it mean that you need to, earn income from that as objects that you make or things that you make in the world? So I don't know, but I do think that it's complicated, as Rick would say.
And that's a good answer. And I'm on the same page where I've had these instances where recently I had an opportunity to make a nice sum of money to do what I do here. But I had a lot of sort of, it wasn't, green M&Ms, but it was some considerations that were there because it's precious and to me, and it's something that is work to me, and it's something that I enjoy, but also I don't want it to be sort of the income driver because I've dabbled with that. I've stuck a toe in the water for that in the past. And you go through, at least I would go through at the end of the year, you do your taxes and all of that different stuff. And I'm like, why did I do that again? Oh, right. Because I didn't have any funding. So I ended up collaborating with this person, and I did some interviews as a ghost podcaster or an MC or or whatever. And it just wasn't alignment. And, when I moved on and sort of thinking about what I was doing and really checking in with myself, I'm like, I don't want those entanglements. It has to pass multiple filters, and being able to have, like, for me, it's freedom. Like, there have been folks that I've reached out to in doing this pod, and they have offered funding and so on. Cause this podcast will be free, but it's not free to make.
Yes.
And they will reach out, and they love what I do. Right. But then at the same time, they want to tell me exactly how to do it. Oh, we don't want you doing any interviews outside of Baltimore. So if I followed that
right
versus my own taste and interest, we wouldn't be having this conversation or have you. And that's the thing, that it feels short-sighted. It feels, as I've said it before, a lot of times people in suits don't have taste.
Well, and I think that there's also that, and I don't want to throw sort of like the commercial gallery world under the bus in any way, but everybody needs to eat, right? Everybody needs to eat. Everybody needs to make rent, whether you're an artist or whether you're a gallerist or whether you're, a podcaster, right? And so everybody, is needs to survive, and everybody wants to, have their values appreciated and wants to live in alignment with their values, right? Everybody would say that that's what they want. And I think that, for some people, being that kind of full-time artist in whatever, discipline that is, that can really happen for them. And I think for other people, that's harder. It's harder to do. And so, having work that is adjacent to the creative practice is still really rich because it keeps you in that community and it keeps you engaged with that community and really kind of learning different things, because you're learning about sort of the back end of things, which can be incredibly useful to that creative practice on the front end.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I find that when we're doing something that's unique or that feels like, I don't know if this is a safe bet. It's like the film industry. You know what I mean? It's like, this movie's a little experiment. I don't think we can fund it. Oh, this is a winner? Here, all of the money. Here you go.
Right.
And, I find like I'm having those conversations all the time, and I try to keep that line very specific. So, the reason I was there in Chicago was because it was funded, in part by my day job because I'm in higher ed. And I was like, this works out, this aligns. And I look at the higher ed thing, not really as you touched on earlier, sort of how we identify ourselves and what's the word we'd use. I use podcaster before I use what my day job is, even though that's the funder or what have you. And my personality is really connected to what that job is, but very much so. This is where I feel most free and most good. And speaking of which, when it comes to unique, the idea of uniqueness, could you talk a bit about sort of your time at 21C, and how, sort of the unique concept and some of the uniqueness of your role has maybe influenced how you approach, from like where you started, in the beginning of your time at 21C to like now, sort of those unique interactions and a unique way of doing things being sort of a Jane. Let's go with Jane of all trades. Having so many being on your, having to be on your toes or what have you. Talk about sort of that uniqueness and how that's influenced how you go about your work now.
Yeah, that's a great question. That's a tough one. And I sort of think of it in two ways. One, sort of me personally, the work I was doing before versus the work that I'm doing now. Prior to this, I was running a photo-based organization. But prior to that, I ran an exhibition space that was not photo based, and it was just sort of very open in terms of disciplines. So a gallery that showed kind of all different types of contemporary art, and then have kind of been steeped in photography for the past 8 years. And so being at 21C was definitely sort of a little more freeing, and the artists that I've been working with and the organizations that I've been working with, and it's like not sort of being so discipline specific, has been really refreshing for me to kind of get back to kind of opening up that space again in my head, in terms of being able to work with other kinds of artists. And so that's been exciting. And then, it is interesting being kind of the only person on property that is kind of the museum department, right? And my colleagues are primarily folks in the sales office, but I would say the people that maybe understand what I do the best are like the engineers. And so it's kind of this interesting mix and an interesting place to sit, literally in the office, and also kind of figuratively, because I definitely think that there's people that have been here long enough and had experience kind of with the previous museum manager. They kind of understand it, and they've kind of seen the various things that we do throughout the year. But I think certainly, people that are also kind of newer here, they kind of see me giving public tours, and they see me, kind of, dusting frames, and think maybe that sort of that's the extent of it. But it's, they don't necessarily see the things that are happening on the back end and kind of, the research aspect of things, or, when you're meeting with artists and doing studio visits, those are things that are kind of, I'm in my little silo. And so that's been kind of interesting to kind of see. I think most people are used to being in a job where there's other people in your department, right? And so this is one where, like in Chicago, like, I'm my own department. And I think that that's also the advantage of kind of having multiple 21Cs, is that all the museum managers are kind of, in that same boat. Yeah. And so, we chat on Zoom, and we have kind of some team building meetings and exercises, and there's a museum summit and things like that, so that we do have the opportunity to kind of come together. And it's not only sort of talking about best practices, but also not feeling like you're the alone in the room. But it's definitely a great network, because if I'm struggling with I'm having an AV problem, but it's an art specific AV problem, I certainly have a team of people that I can go to ask those questions. But so I think that's definitely been an interesting place to be, because it's a little bit different, I think, than a lot of other kind of art jobs. And I feel like I've lost the thread of the question.
No, you're good. You're cooking. I love it. It's helpful. You made me think in terms of like being sort of your own department, right? It's like I just vision, right? I had this vision in my head as you were describing sort of like some of the ins and outs of your role and sort of the uniqueness of it. Just some artists, it's like, I need to speak with your manager, and you just turn around slightly, maybe changing something. It's like, oh my, I'm going to put my hair this way. I am the
Right.
manager. It's like
Right.
you're just the same person. Yeah, that's how big our department is. This
Yes.
is what I do.
Right, right. I mean, that's not to say there's not, there's tremendous support here in Chicago, which I greatly appreciate, so it's not only kind of the support across 21Cs, within the kind of museum department overall, but I think here in Chicago, there's the entire staff, I think there's a really great appreciation for the mission and for the values of the organization, which is really great. I don't get a lot of, there's not a lot of no, there's not a lot of no, you can't do that. There's a lot of, that sounds exciting,
Yeah.
which I appreciate just sort of the overall, attitude of positivity that I think that, an entire staff of people that are not necessarily trained in art, and yet there's still this enormous positivity about the art, which you can't really ask for more than that.
It's almost the improv energy. It's just flows. It's like, yes, and that's interesting. Yeah, go on, continue. And I think that is a great environment to, it feels collaborative. It feels like moving towards and being mission driven and goal driven versus some other environments that folks are in that are working in. It's kind of what I touched on a moment ago. Like, all right, what's the dollar associated with it? What is the win? How can we? It's all of these other things other than, is this a cool idea and can we do it? And this is something that we're into that aligns with our values. It feels like there's all of these other sort of checks that one has to hit that really aren't the most important. They're important for someone, but not the most important thing for that particular moment.
Mhm.
So I want to go back a little bit and talk about education. So having that strong education background. So as far as like your time, your tenure as an educator, and I've played the education game for the last year as well, which I'll pull my nails. I feel like I'm seasoned in that area, but also terrified to go back. Talk a bit about how sort of your experience as an educator has served you, like in your current role, and then sort of like you look back and you see like sort of an interaction or sort of the troubleshooting that goes along with some aspects of your day to day, like how sort of that strong foundation and background in education like serves your work today.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of ways, right? I'm sort of thinking about this in two different ways. Like at the beginning of your question, I was thinking this way. And then kind of as you were wrapping up that question, I was thinking about it another way. And maybe I'll start at that end and kind of work my way back. I think, if you've worked at any large education institution, you understand the bureaucracy, you understand how to work with a variety of constituents, right? It's like I'm working with students, but I'm also working with faculty, and I'm also working with, people in the provost office and people, and so there's sort of all at a university, there's all of these people, right? All of these people at play, and everybody's needs are different. And so I think having spent a lot of time as a, university administrator and faculty person, and kind of seeing all of the kind of ins and outs of that, which is of course a very different preparation for any work anywhere than actually being in the classroom. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that those years as an administrator in a academic environment, I think really prepares you for a lot of things in the world. But as far as being an educator and actually being in the classroom, that's often the first word out of my mouth, right? In terms of like, tell us about yourself, right? I definitely think of myself as an educator. And I think it's because whether I'm standing in front of a group of undergraduate students or whether I'm, doing portfolio reviews with artists or doing public tours here at 21C, it's just always a hat that I'm wearing and comfortable wearing. And I think for me, a lot of that is, having done that for so long, it becomes sort of a natural way of talking and being with other people. And that, I want to provide information in a way that is digestible for whoever I'm with, right? And, I really enjoy teaching undergraduate students in particular. And for so many years, I taught like intro students. And so I'd get those like Photo One students. And those are actually my preferred sort of group of students, which is, I think, a little different than what a lot of people might say. They want to work with like the advanced students. I want to work with those intro students because I think that they come into an art class thinking that they know what art is. And I get to be the person that kind of, shakes that up for them.
Yeah.
And, it really becomes more about visual literacy. And I think about that every time I'm giving a public tour, right? Like it isn't just about learning about 21C or learning about this artist. It's about visual literacy. It's about learning to see and understand art in the world. And so I really see that as how all of my various hats kind of come together, is being able to kind of, I'm comfortable talking in a, group of people. And, I definitely feel like this is always the way I want a conversation about art to go, right? Art today is it's about stuff. It's not just about the way something looks or what an artist was thinking or feeling when they made it, but it's about how it sits in the world today. And so being able to really help people unpack that is something that I'm really passionate about. And so that's kind of always the hat that I'm wearing, no matter where I am or what I'm doing. That's my sort of personal mission is like, how do I open this up for people and help them to not only, and it's less about even appreciating it, but like beginning to understand it.
Thank you. I think it's something about like sort of the having, I guess, someone that's more in the intro stage, in the undergrad stage, and being able to see someone with not a ton of experience where those sort of habits come in of, oh, I know how to do this. It's like, no, let's shake up the idea. Let's restart it. And that's in the two instances that I've in the last year done some educational work. It's been high school seniors, and which oh,
Yeah, I've done that too.
and then it was like sort of an intro class in podcasting at a college. And, one, it kept me honest in that, hey, I've been doing this for a while, but being able to go back and say, how do I do that again?
Mhm.
And not thinking like not doing the autopilot thing, which I think is when you do it so long, you have a process like, in the past, let's say a couple of years ago, when I started this particular podcast, it might take me a half an hour, 45 minutes to set up and just kind of get right and get in the right headspace. Now it's like I've already done my prep. I'm already good. Let's just hit the buttons. Everything is queued up. Everything is set up. But if I'm showing that and teaching someone that and, helping them get past things that's not even with the equipment, but sort of the theory behind why do you want to do this podcast? Why do you want to do, ask these questions? That's literally, the most recent class that I did, it was around that and
Yeah.
almost sharing my own concepts and philosophies on, I remember at one point, students asking, how are we going to do editing? I was like, oh, we'll get to editing because I know editing sucks. It's like, it's not going to be great.
Right.
Yeah. And when we got there, they were like, oh, so the lesson is we should hire an editor. I was like, yes,
Yeah.
that's actually the lesson. But
Yeah.
sharing this notion of what I like to call pre-editing. I was like, in your planning and all of that, you have so strong of a foundation that you don't have to even spend that much time editing.
Mhm.
You should edit in these ways. But if you have like a solid foundation and a solid concept and all of this foundational stuff, and the golden moment, if you will, in that class and even in the high school cohort was when you almost see the light bulb go off. It was like, oh, you got it. You were listening to me.
Yeah.
Great. And I can say this firsthand before I move into this next question. I have two more after this, but the the Columbus Crossroads event, the CXC event. I was invited by higher ed, like folks in design, and I did this panel. And I go in there. I was like, I don't talk in front of people. It's like I'm gonna bomb this. I just go full gallows humor. I was like, come watch me bomb. I'm gonna self implode on stage. And I got feedback afterwards from dude. I think Blinky teaches like pop culture and comics. That's like what his degree and his background is in. And he was just like, yeah, you do teach, don't you? He's like, you did this like a teacher. And I always hear that from people, and maybe that's part of the identity I should start affixing to myself, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of one, teacher voice, right? And also just sort of um, kind of that mental organization, right? Like I want to present this in a particular way, right? And sometimes it's asking the questions that you know other people should be asking, but they aren't, right? Here's the questions that I know need to actually happen today, even though nobody's asking them. How do I orchestrate this conversation so that we get to that?
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. I'm definitely strategio. I like to like to have everything ordered. So I'm very curious about this one. Like, and I think I'm gonna start inserting it into more interviews because I have a person that is a dude named Aaron that I talk to on occasion, and whenever I'm at like sort of an impasse, like again, this is a unique thing, and I've been doing it for a while, and I'm trying to as I maybe approach new stages on this sort of journey, and I don't like the word journey. It's good as a band, but not as a concept. I every now and again I run into like a roadblock, creatively as to I want to do this. Does this fit? How do I get there? And yeah, I try to bounce an idea off of someone, getting that good counsel, but you can't bounce it off everyone.
Right.
And so for you, whether it's, and you touched on sort of the network within 21C, but could you speak a bit on like if you're brainstorming for an idea or a concept that you want to pitch or things of that nature, talk about sort of like maybe who you get that good counsel from, or maybe a piece of advice that was given to you in your career that's been really, really something you look back on. Like, yeah, that's the direction. I'm going to go in that direction.
Honestly, this was the hardest question for me. This is totally the hardest question. And why is that? I think because for me, it's like a network, right? And it's not like I have a go-to person. It totally depends. I was talking about this, upcoming interview with my son, who's 16 and in a band. And we were talking about Rick Rubin. And he also, with his band, had done an interview recently. And so, last night we were kind of talking through different interview questions.
Sure.
And so to me, that was a really rich conversation because he's coming at it, one at a completely different age than me, but also as a musician. And so that's a really useful one. Or, even talking to my daughter, recently sort of about kind of philosophy and social theory because she's a senior in college and she's working on her thesis in sociology, and I have a bachelor's in sociology. And so for me, which I've told her in the past, like often instead of a person that I go to, I lean back on that, so on sociology, right? So for me, the sort of like bookish research dork in me is like always there under the surface. And so if I have to write anything art related, if I have to write a description of an exhibition, or, I'm trying to put together, an exhibition or just, a couple of artists, and it's like, what ties those together?
Sure.
I always sort of lean back on that kind of social theory history that I have. And the reason that I do that is really just because I'm sort of looking for ways to articulate my language. And so sometimes, having a conversation with another, social theorist dork is a great person to talk that through with and, kind of bounce ideas off of, even though they have nothing to do with art, right? For me, it's about kind of building these kind of threads between things. But I think, some of the best advice that wasn't even delivered as advice that I got in graduate school was I put some artwork on the table and, group critique day, everybody put your work out. And I put these photographs out that I had made. And my professor, Lynn Sloan, said, "This is a very successful body of work, but it's not for me." And I thought, that was my light bulb moment, like that, especially like as a maker and as an educator, it like blew my mind and still continues to be a really important thing that I understand about the way that we understand art, right? Like there is a difference between something that we like and something that is successful. And we confuse that in our culture all the time. And especially when we're talking about art, music, film, any of those things, I don't like that. I don't like that music. I don't like that movie. I don't like that picture. I'm standing in front of a painting I don't understand, so I just don't like it. And so I think that's just not the way we want to think about that, right?
Yeah.
And so to have this, professor sort of have this really profound statement kind of right away, to be able to recognize that what she was looking at, she could recognize that it was successful, but she just didn't want it hanging over her couch. And like, I get that, right? Like, can we get to a point where we understand and appreciate something as being successful, even though it maybe isn't something that we like and personally want to consume, right? Like, I can appreciate, that music for all of its sort of amazing creativity and technicality, but it isn't necessarily something that I'm going to listen to on a regular basis. And I think we can say this kind of across the board for sort of any. I often use my husband as an example, who's not a fan of horror films. And so when he watches a horror film, he's like, I didn't like this at all. It's like, well, you didn't like it because you don't like the way you feel, but it's a horror film and you're not actually supposed to feel good after you watch that, right? Like, if you're scared by the horror film was actually successful, right? And so, that's like this little microcosm of what that really means in the bigger scope of things when it comes to, art, music, theater, dance, anything, right? I don't like it doesn't mean it wasn't good.
That is such a great point. It's like you were tap dancing in my head and extracted, one of these things that I say like all the time. When I do a movie review podcast that I really need to get back to, but I've done it for a couple of years and a little bit of a hiatus, but I have this idea in it. I'm selecting movies that I like, or movies that are in their sort of anniversary years. But sort of the idea is, it doesn't need to be a quote unquote critically acclaimed movie or even financially successful movie. But I always have this sort of concept, even if I like the movie, I already have this one criticism. I call it just one fix. Let's say this movie is a C. I have a fix that I see in it that I think I can move it to a B.
Mm.
And I try to think through things in that way. Or even if it comes to like a dish or something, and it's just like, well, they're not going to just say this sucked. That's too easy.
Right.
It's too easy to do that. Let's get into maybe why I didn't like it, or why it wasn't for me, or what have you, or even doing this podcast. And I'm trying to work on my shade of other podcasts that are out there. I'm like, oh yeah, I've heard of that
which is
podcast.
which is criticism, right? And I think that culturally we think of the word criticism as a negative thing, but like in the arts we don't think of that as a critical. Critical isn't bad. Critical is, we're having a deep conversation about it, and we are talking about parts that are successful and parts that are less successful. And so I think that beginning to understand criticism as something that is positive,
Yeah.
I think, is really useful.
It's consideration in my head. It was like, you're actually spending some time with it to absorb it. And I remember having a conversation talking about this pod at the day job, and my boss, she was like, I don't get art. I was just like, I don't, that's for,
That's a
and
broad statement.
right. And she was like, you do this. She's like, I'm sure it's good. I was like, no, it's fine. Some people like it. And, I chimed in. I was like, well, I guess it might be how you feel. Did you get a response from a particular piece? Did you see something out there? It's like, well, I like this. I was like, well, there you go. You got art. I was like, that's my take on it. And sometimes it feels a little rarefied, and that feels like it's a whole different conversation for a different pod.
Mhm.
But I think that's sort of the thing, is at least that consideration, being exposed to it and not just shutting it off of, this isn't for me. Or I run into people like, this is too white, this is too black, this is too this is too that. And it's just like, yeah, let's remove all of that other stuff, judge it on the merits and what's right in front of you.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think that, people don't learn to do that. And I think that, that kind of brings me back to sort of my educator hat. And when I think about teaching a class that's about visual literacy, it's about that, right? It's about trying to help people understand that, like, it's okay to have an opinion, right? It's okay to like or to not like something, absolutely. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't continue to think about the sort of critical aspects of whatever that is, right? Like, why don't you like it, or why do you like it? And begin to kind of be able to articulate a little bit more than just your opinion.
Yeah. And the last thing I was saying before I move to this last question is, as I think the term they use for me is Jurassic millennial, which I don't like it. But I remember it was this thing. I was the infographic I was reading, and they were talking about like millennials. You can tell they're a millennial because it's they're always saying something like, "Don't judge me," and
Mhm.
it's sort of that sort of lack of having like what do you stand on? What is your sort of your take on this? And I get so thrown off because it's like everyone has a take, but then they're not really standing on that take. Like, look, sometimes there has to be a hill that you're going to die on, and maybe some people just say mac and cheese sucks. Just own it. Or maybe someone like me is like, look, maybe it's a different cheese you should use. Maybe it's a different
All
noodle.
right.
I don't
Try some
know.
Gouda, right?
Right. Maybe make it smoked Gouda. Who knows?
Right?
So this is the last question, and this is more of a sort of the summary and sort of like what's coming forth. So what's next for you? Like, what do you have coming up? Projects, 21C related,
Yeah,
your own personal projects that are coming up.
sure.
Anything that's coming up in the next 6 months or so that you're super excited for that you want to discuss?
Well, we've got lots of exciting things on 21C Chicago's event calendar, but I would say the number one thing I'm excited about is a book fair, a book and print fair that we are doing in November. So it's called Staple and Stitch, and it is happening at 21C November 15th to 17th. And it is an art book and print fair organized by me. And I began it because there was really a need in Chicago. We had the Chicago Art Book Fair from 2017 to 2019, but since then there really hasn't been anything like it. And I think it's something that the community has really been hungry for. So we've got over 60 vendors. It'll be 2.5 days of folks that make books, make prints. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. I think it's going to be an awesome weekend. We've got programming, we'll have talks and all kinds of things in addition to vendors having amazing stuff on their tables.
That's great. I pulled up the website. I'm looking at it now. I
Thank
love
you.
the colors. I love the colors.
Awesome.
This is
Yes.
great.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's really exciting. I like having sort of that, identifying sort of you touched on like wasn't something that was there, there was a need, and it's like identifying it and then using sort of the space and the connections there to say, let's try to fill that need. So that's
Yeah,
really
absolutely.
all right. We got all the real questions out of the way. Now it's time to get to the rapid fire questions.
The ones I haven't seen.
The ones you have not seen.
Okay.
But these are Chicago related mostly.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah, it's gonna be easy for you. It's gonna be
All
easy.
right. Got it.
And don't overthink these, whatever first thing that comes to mind. So when we met in Chicago, I got to indulge during that week in some of the local eats.
Hmm.
So what is like, one Chicago food you think everyone should try? There are some of the ones that have really good press, they have a really good publicist, a food publicist. But what, in your opinion, what is, a Chicago food that everyone should try if they come to visit?
Honestly, it is the Chicago hot dog,
Okay.
not deep dish pizza. Let me stop you there. Mainly because deep dish pizza, like we don't eat that. I mean, yeah, like when people come in from out of town, sure, sure. Yeah, yeah. But the Chicago style hot dog, when I go to other cities, yeah, I might try their hot dog, but I'm just never going to put ketchup on a hot dog. Like it just doesn't happen. Like that's just not right. So yeah, I think especially because it's different.
Yeah.
I recognize that it's different, but people that in Chicago actually do eat the Chicago style hot dog. Like it is a normal thing to eat for lunch.
That is great. If you ever make it to Baltimore, I will buy you a crab cake.
Okay.
That you can try our thing here. Some people throw out, pit beef is one of our things.
Okay.
I'm a crab guy. I go with the crabs.
All right.
But also I had the Chicago style dog, which was delicious. And
Yes.
I remember you talking about the pizza thing, and I immediately thought of the Kyle Kinane joke. He's like, you take your aunt that's coming into town. I was like, we'll try it. She's like, you don't like it.
Yeah, you don't like it. I mean, it's a lot of cheese.
It,
Yeah.
it was, and we were on a
Yes.
freaking walk. I was like, I have a brick in my stomach. What are we
Yes.
doing?
I mean, it's tasty, but at the same time, it's like a once a year kind of thing.
It's lasagna.
It is lasagna. Yeah, it's lasagna pretending to be pizza.
Masquerading. If you could recommend one Chicago like cultural experience, obviously outside of food, we touched on food. What would that cultural experience be? And as I pad a little bit here, I had the time. I was switzing everywhere, but I had the opportunity to go to a Cubs game, which was on my list of things to do, and it was everything I was hoping for. It was really great, except for the heat. You know,
Mm.
but what would be like a cultural experience? Obviously, 21C, because I mean, I enjoyed that as well as part
Yes,
of
of
my.
course. I mean, Wrigley Field is a great place to go. I would recommend definitely go to Wrigley if you have not been, but definitely there's a lot of folks that are, not going to be baseball or sports people, and they're going to be like, that's not my thing. Um, I would say the Chicago Cultural Center. The
Okay.
Cultural Center is right downtown, so easy to access. It's free and open to the public. It is the former or the original kind of public library and a beautiful architectural building. And so, kind of gorgeous Tiffany dome upstairs, a couple of Tiffany domes, and kind of really exciting contemporary art exhibitions, again, all free. And so, but also very user friendly, right? Like you can go in and just like sit down at a table and like have a meeting with someone. It's a big space with a lot of things. And so I think it's a really great place if people want to just go and appreciate the architecture or the building itself. You just need to get, off the street and take a little break. Or if you want to look at, at art, it kind of has all of those things. Yeah, it's a great place to go. I would highly recommend the Chicago Cultural Center.
That's great. Here's the last one. I touched on it earlier that, I enjoy movies. I also enjoy horror movies. So there are a number of movies and television properties that have Chicago in the name or Chicago is the setting of said movie. Most recently, I rewatched the original Candyman last week, and I was like, great, I can see it on a big screen. Philip Glass, noted Baltimorean, did the score for it, so that's really tight. And also, I'm mid 80s, so I obviously think of Ferris Bueller's Day Off. So when I'm thinking of like Chicago movies or movies set in Chicago, what is your favorite movie set in Chicago?
Oh man, this one's tough. Ferris Bueller is a pretty, I would say, like universal favorite among Chicagoans. He doesn't live in Chicago. He lives in the North Shore, but so much of that whole like day downtown and kind of hitting all those sort of iconic places. It's a fun one. It's one that like when you're a kid growing up in Chicago, like you definitely see Ferris Bueller. I also think the Blues Brothers, right, is kind of a really
Really?
fun movie. That's also one that it's kind of like standard American viewing, right? Like, how do you get through life not having seen the Blues Brothers, right? And so I think that it's also one like that is, I mean, it's such an all-star cast. The music is incredible. It's also, I think, given that it was late 70s, early 80s when they shot the Blues Brothers, like Chicago has changed so much. And for those of us that are Gen Xers or older, right? It is a really fun way to kind of look back and see, like Maxwell Street Market isn't there anymore. And so there's a lot of things, a lot of historic things in that film that we've kind of lost a little bit. Even the sort of scenes where like Dan Aykroyd with his like apartment that's right on the L and the apartment going by and like rattling the whole place. That's a thing. But, so much of that infrastructure is like changing in the city now.
Mhm.
So it definitely feels like an old world, old school Chicago vibe about it. That is, it's always a fun one.
That's great. Thank you. That is, you're off the hot seat, and I agree with. I love the Blues Brothers, all of it. It's good. It works. So that's kind of it for the pod and the questions. So there's two things I want to do as we close out here. One, I want to thank you for coming on and spending some time with me. This has been a treat.
Thank you.
And two, I'm going to invite and encourage you to share with the listeners. Pretty much, this is the shameless plug portion. So if you want to, plug Staple and Stitch again, if you want to plug anything 21C related, anything your stuff related, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Rob. I appreciate this. It's been really fun chatting. I love an interview where we can kind of play off of each other and it's not just stick to the question. So I appreciate that. Yeah. So I guess the shameless plug. plug is for 21C Museum hotels, not just in Chicago, but kind of all locations. Check out our websites. And for me here in Chicago, definitely Staple and Stitch. You can find the website if you go to Staple and Stitch Art Book and Print Fair. And all of those things are also on Instagram. 21C Chicago has its own website. We have a great event calendar, lots of exciting things happening there. So if you're ever through Chicago, come and see us. And if you're going to be in town in November, definitely come to the Art Book Fair.
And there you have it, folks. I want to again thank the great Jennifer Murray for coming on and spending some time with me today. And for Jennifer Murray from the 21C Museum Hotel Chicago, I am Rob Lee, saying that there's art, culture, and community in and around your neck of the woods. You've just got to look for it.